afternoon, and thank you for being here today. My name is Nicholas Marcus Thompson. I'm President and CEO of the Black Class Action Secretariat, and I'm joined today by Nathan Pryor of the Canadian Association of Professional Employees, Katie Francis from the Professional Institute of the Public Service of Canada, Tyler Boyce from the Ashanti Network, Meseret Hele Jesus from the Canadian Centre for Women Empowerment. Nearly 40 years ago, Canada passed the Employment Equity Act to address systemic discrimination and barriers in the workplace. It applies across federally regulated sectors and affects about 1 million workers. It shapes who sits at decision-making tables in this country. In 2020, public service workers launched a class action challenging the constitutionality of this act, arguing that it is outdated and allows systemic discrimination to persist. In 2021, the government responded and established the Employment Equity Act Task Force. In 2023, the task force provided its recommendations, and the government accepted them with a commitment to modernizing the act, and it also laid two very important commitments at that point. It promised to recognize Black people and 2S LGBTQIA plus individuals as employment equity groups, adding on to the additional 4 groups of Indigenous people, women, people with disabilities, and racialized people. Since 2024, progress has slowed significantly, and there is no clear timeline for legislative change. That's why over 20 organizations from across the country have come together to establish the National Employment Equity Council. And today, we're launching the council. Its mandate is to push for the implementation of the task force recommendations, to monitor progress, and hold institutions accountable. And we're inviting organizations from across the country to join us in advancing this work. Because when progress stalls, the impact is real. Barriers remain and opportunities continue to be out of reach, with growing costs for the country as a whole. At the same time, the world is changing. Earlier this year in Davos, Prime Minister Mark Carney spoke about how countries like Canada must adapt to remain strong and competitive. And that raises a simple question. Who is at the table when decisions are being made? Because when people are included, we make better decisions, we draw on more talent, and we build stronger institutions. And that's what this is about, isn't it? So that's why we're here today. There are 187 recommendations, but many come down to a few key priorities. And today we're asking the Government of Canada to begin implementation now, starting with 4 key steps. And that is to recognize Black workers and 2S LGBTQIA plus workers as employment equity groups under the Act, to strengthen oversight so the law delivers real results, and to improve workforce data so barriers can be clearly identified, and require employment equity plans with measurable goals. These changes strengthen the Act for everyone and make it work as it was intended to. They address discrimination, they create stronger accountability, and they improve transparency and reporting. They help ensure that Canada meets its human rights obligations, and they make our institutions more effective, including a stronger, more responsive public service. So this is about building an economy that makes full use of the talent that exists in this country. Once implemented, these changes will remove barriers in hiring and promotion. They will improve representation at all levels, including leadership, and they will ensure decisions are based on the full talent available in this country. And they will ensure that there are consequences where progress is not being made. So we're calling for these steps to take place in the next budget, which should be tabled later on this year in the fall. I'll now invite Tyler from the Ashanti Network to give some remarks.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. And hello to those of you in the room and also to those of you who are watching at home. My name is Tyler Boyce. I'm the Executive Director of the Enchanté Network. We are Canada's largest network of 2S LGBTQI+ organizations, representing more than 300 queer and trans organizations spanning every single province in Canada. Today, I'm here in my capacity as one of the inaugural co-chairs of the National Employment Equity Council, a national coordinating body representing more than 20 unions, human rights, advocacy, and community-based organizations from across Canada. We are established to advance the modernization of the Employment Equity Act. And I'm speaking to you today because I'm concerned that a promise has not quite been kept. As my colleague explained, in December of 2023, then Minister of Labour, Seamus O'Regan, announced long-awaited plans to modernize the Federal Employment Equity Act, particularly to include Black and 2S LGBTQI+ communities as designated groups under that act. This announcement was made after more than 2 years of national consultation and as a result of the final Employment Equity Task Force report that was led by Dr. Adele Blackett. This announcement was largely understood as a historic commitment. I remember that at the Enchanté Network, we actually stood in a press gallery, kind of like this, alongside then Minister of Labour to make that historic announcement in Canada. And like many Canadians, we believed that this was going to be a moment of change. However, more than 3 years later in 2026 and tens of thousands of taxpayer dollars spent, we haven't seen that promise translate into action. So I'm here today to talk to you about that gap between commitment and implementation. It's not about partisanship, it's really about trust, because a strong democracy requires a civil society that can trust the public promises and commitments made by their government. Fulfilling this promise is now the responsibility of Minister Patty Hajdu, but we have seen limited movement from that office. When we saw in action at the Enchanté Network, we once again did our part as civil society. Just this past September, the Enchanté Network brought more than 30 delegates from 2S LGBTQI+ organizations spanning more than 10 provinces in this country. We met with more than 30 MPs and senators from Canada's largest parties, and what we found was cross-party support for the modernization of Canada's Federal Employment Equity Act. And noticeably, there was also a lot of surprise, even within the Liberal caucus, that these changes had not already been implemented, because we all saw the very public announcement. So as a first priority, this council is calling on the Government of Canada to take immediate action in the next federal budget to advance key elements of the task force report, including the formal recognition of Black workers and 2S LGBTQI+ workers as designated groups under the Employment Equity Act. We know that Black Canadians continue to experience higher unemployment, lower earnings, and underrepresentation in leadership. We also know that 2S LGBTQI+ Canadians experience very similar trends against the backdrop of a global rise in anti-hate and really against our ability to live with dignity, justice, and equal opportunity. The Employment Equity Act applies to more than 1 million workers, with sectors including the federal public service, banking, telecommunication, and transportation. And at a time of global economic uncertainty and renewed conversations about Canada's competitiveness, it is the right, just, wise thing to do to utilize our full workforce. And so Canada has an opportunity to lead here, like we have before, but leadership requires follow-through. And the National Employment Equity Council is ready and willing to act as a partner with this government as it commits to that follow-through. Thank you very much for your time and for your attention. And with that, I'll invite Messi, the Executive Director of the Canadian Centre for Women Empowerment, to give a few remarks as well. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Messi Haile Jesus, Executive Director of the Canadian Centre for Women Empowerment, and an economic justice advocate and a member of the National Employment Equity Implementation Council. Today, I stand in full support of strengthening and amending the Employment Equity Act. So strengthening this act has a direct impact on women because empowerment is not only about opportunity, it's all about access. When the systems are fair, women can enter to the workforce, grow, lead, and build economic security. But when the systems are weak, women, especially Black women and other marginalized groups, are excluded, overlooked, and left behind. The Employment Equity Act applies to approximately, of course, 1 million workers across federally regulated sectors, including the federal public service, banking, telecommunication, and transportation. It shapes who gets hired, who gets promoted, and who has the access to leadership. But today, the system is not delivering equitable outcomes, especially for Black women. So Black women are highly educated, highly skilled, deeply resilient, but yet they continue to face higher unemployment, lower earning, and persistent wage gap. In Canada, women earn on average 10 to 13% less than men, and the gap even wider for racialized and Black women. They are also underrepresented in leadership, overrepresented in low-paying and precarious work. This is not about pipeline issue. This is not about capacity issue. It's all about systemic employment equity issues. Canada loses $1 billion productivity in innovation when Black women are not fully included in the workforce. Business loses talent, community loses leadership, and strengthening this act is very critical. It's all about correcting the structural inequalities in our labor market and ensuring that Black women have fair access to compete, advance, and lead. The modernization of this act will strengthen accountability, improve also our data, and ensure barriers in hiring, paying, and promotion are addressed directly. It will also allow, especially for Black and marginalized women, especially women who experience in gender-based violence, specifically on economic abuse, they are formally recognized because without recognition, there is no any visibility. Without visibility, there is no any accountability. So as the Canadian Centre for Empowerment, as we are the only agency in Canada addressing all forms of economic abuse, and as a member of the Council, we stand along with all our labor union, human rights organization, academic institution, and community across Canada. And today, we're calling for action, and we're calling the Government of Canada to move forward with meaningful reform to deliver real and measurable results for employment equity. We are also calling for the inclusion of Employment Equity Act modernization measure in all federal budgets. We are also calling the formal recognitions of Black women, specifically when we talk about women, we exclude women who experience gender-based violence. They are also part of this group because this is essential in addressing specific and systemic barriers, and these women face in employment, and it's very critical to support the National Employment Equity Implementation Council. So this is a defining moment for the government because when Black women face access to employment, leadership, they just don't participate in the economy. They strengthen and grow, and it leads forward. And thank you. So I will invite the next speaker, Nathan Pryor, the president of the Canadian Association Professionals Employee. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Nathan Pryor. I'm the president of the Canadian Association of Professional Employees. So you've just heard from my three colleagues here, Nicholas, Tyler, and Mezzi, about the failure of the recommendations that were clearly laid out to be actually implemented. And I'm speaking here on behalf of a federal public service union, so I'll speak to those concerns in particular. But all of these recommendations must urgently be moved forward across all federally regulated sectors if we're actually going to make some progress in this country that was promised. But the federal government, which is the nation's biggest employer, in particular, has a responsibility to build a public service that represents the diversity of this country. That's the only way for our government to work for all Canadians. It's also one of the ways, as my colleague spoke to guarantee that we recruit and we retain the best talent. Strong equity systems mean that we're not letting talent go to waste because of systemic discrimination. Taxpayers deserve better than that. But as Cape emphasized in our February appearance before the Standing Senate Committee on Human Rights, real progress on employment equity can quickly be reversed by sweeping, ideological austerity measures that don't track its equity impacts. So we know this, and yet, as the public service is now being hit with widespread historic layoff threats, and tens of thousands of workers are set to lose their jobs, after a decade of modest equity improvements in the federal workforce, the biggest employer in this country is ignoring very clear recommendations on employment equity. So without strong protection systems in place up front, and without sharing the data that we know they have on the equity impacts of their mass layoffs, equity-deserving workers, their unions, and the Canadian public are kept in the dark on whether major discrimination in these wildly ideological layoffs is happening. Et là, je vais passer en français. Donc, nous savons que certains des ministères les plus touchés par les coupes d'emploi, notamment EDSC et Services aux Autochtones Canada, sont ceux qui ont toujours défendu la diversité. Cela devrait en soi montrer à quel point le gouvernement de Mark Carney attache à l'importance de la diversité de ses effectifs. Le fait qu'aucune mesure sérieuse et réfléchie n'ait été prise pour garantir que les groupes méritant l'équité ne soient pas touchés de manière disproportionnée par ces mesures d'austérité constitue un manquement flagrant aux obligations du gouvernement. And I'll go back to English. So this is why CAPE is here today, to demand that the Employment Equity Task Force recommendations be taken back off the shelf and implemented fully. And one of those recommendations was collecting disaggregated data and applying an intersectional policy lens to policy decisions. So historic austerity is a pretty serious policy decision. So we, workers, our unions, need access to refined data that allows us to see if systemic discrimination is happening in real time, not in a year or more after thousands of federal workers have already been laid off. That's way too late, and the harm will already have been done. So the refusal to put into action what we know is necessary to prevent discrimination during these massive job cuts means the government is more than fine with a discriminatory outcome. But we're not. And a roadmap already exists in the task force recommendations that have not been implemented. And that roadmap includes stronger accountability, better data, and embedding stronger mandatory equity impact assessments into all workforce adjustment or layoff decisions. Thank you. And I'm now going to call on Philomene Zangio, who is with the New Brunswick Council of People of African Descent, to say a few words. Okay, go.
We're having some technical difficulties, so Philomene will not be joining us today. So we'll wrap up the presser by stating that Canada is strongest when everyone has a seat at the table, and right now we're just not there yet. So there's a lot of work ahead, and the National Employment Equity Council is committed to doing that, as my colleagues mentioned, that we're committed to working with the Government of Canada, with the Minister's Office, with the OPM, with the PMO's office, and we're committed to working with all stakeholders, and as you could see here, we've brought together the widest coalition, the widest group of interests representing every group in the present act and in the proposed recommendations, bringing together the largest group of stakeholders to champion this cause, because we're committed to building a better Canada, and this act, which as you've heard, it covers the largest segment of employment in this country, and not just the public service, critical infrastructure that and institutions that advance Canada's economic security, banks and telecommunications. So this act is way beyond the public service, and for us, quite frankly, it's a key issue on Canada's economic security. So thank you very much.
Yeah, Mateo Similar, Ottawa citizen. I'm just curious about the origin of this organization. You know, the report comes on 23 with the recommendations. At what point do your organizations start talking and saying, look, we got to do something, we got to form a whole entire organization to push these amendments forward?
Well, at present, employment equity, and for the past while, has been under challenge. Employers are cutting back. Equity is no longer a priority, and we've seen this government, the government of Canada, or the Liberal government of Canada, tabled, after the report came out, it tabled in 2024, in the 2024 budget, it tabled its intention to modernize the Act, right? That's as formal as you can get, but it didn't follow through on that progress, and we're now more than 2 years past that period. So that at that point, all these organizations, recognizing how important this is for this country, decided to come together and to form this body to advocate for the full implementation of that report. And we know how historic it is. These groups are not have been historically marginalized. It's not part of the Act. We continue to see and hear stories about discrimination across this country, from the Privy Council Office to the Canadian Human Rights Commission. Right across this country, deeply embedded is systemic discrimination that causes real harm to people, and not just to them, to their communities, also to the Canadian public that receives these services. So we have, for example, a public service that is operating at a deficit, at a deficit capacity because of injuries. When you have people on sick leave, when you have people showing up to work injured as a result of this discrimination. So the harm is quite real, and our organizations recognize that, and would like to put that forward so that it becomes a priority for this government as it moves to address so many stuff that's happening in the world, so many changes in Canada, so many, the world is changing very quickly. And it is our position that we all need to be at that table. We're all here for Canada.
The new government and the new minister, have you heard? I mean, what have the conversations been like so far? Have they signaled that they want to make this, these amendments? Is it a priority for them? Have you heard anything from the minister's office?
There appears to be some willingness from the government this issue, at least on the political side. There are some challenges on the bureaucracy side. The bureaucracy is always hesitant on change. And this would be a big change, but we want to share with the bureaucracy that this is good change, that this change, that when we remove barriers for some groups, that we all win, that the workplace is better, it's more productive, and it delivers better service to Canadians. So there's nothing to fear by advancing this. And I just want to stress that by advancing these recommendations, it does not remove merit from any process. By implementing these recommendations, it allows marginalized groups to have a fair opportunity to compete without the barriers. And that's so key, especially with all of the rhetoric that's happening in Canada and around the world today on equity. It does not remove the merits of the bona fide merits of the job requirements.
More? Can I get, is it okay? More questions? Sorry. Obviously, it's been a long time coming for this. I mean, what does it tell you when there's been so much heel dragging on this file itself?
We understand that it has been quite a tumultuous time in the world, and we're not negligent to that fact. But at the same time, I think we keep going back to what I shared in my remarks about the ability for civil society and Canadians to believe promises when they happen. 1. 2, for taxpayer money to be spent in good faith and responsibly. Right now, the work has already been done. Yes, we did have an election quite recently, but I think that it's been a bit too much heel dragging, and that's why civil society is coming together to remind the government of their responsibilities to their commitments and of the fact that, there were 187 recommendations in the task force report. Right now, we're asking for the lowest of lowest hanging fruit, which is the designation of Black and 2S LGBTQI+ communities to the Act. It's the most quick, and it's also the least expensive. It's also the one that was already committed to. And so we do have the purview of wanting to see all 187 recommendations fully implemented to take a robust approach. But at the same time, I think that the heel dragging has brought us to the point that now we're speaking to you and to those watching at home, and putting pressure back on the government and giving them another opportunity to make this a good story for this current government.
Yeah, I think on this front, and this is like many other fronts, this government isn't serious about efficiency in government operations. It's not as serious about efficiency in its workforce and maximizing productivity and the talent that it has. And I think there's a lot of examples of how this government is ideological in this war that it's waging on the public sector. You know, firing public servants just to replace them with consultants that cost 125% of the cost. You're losing money when you could have just kept a public servant at their desk. Things like not considering remote work as a cost savings opportunity when their own numbers showed that to the tune of $40 billion, we could have saved a ton of money on remote work and maybe prevented some program cuts like, say, the interim federal health program cuts at IRCC, which is now going to deny refugees preventative care. Those people are just going to smash into the healthcare system later at a higher cost. This isn't efficiency. And to speak to the Employment Equity Task Force recommendations, we are potentially wasting enormous talent. We hear all the time from our members, particularly Black members, about the ceilings that they hit in the public sector, not being able to advance. They go, they reskill, they get more education. They're some of the most overqualified people, but because of systemic discrimination, they're prevented from advancing and they eventually leave the public sector. We are wasting talent at an epic scale here. And as Tyler pointed out, this is one of the most this is one of the easiest ways in which we could guarantee that talent is being maximized. Those other cost savings opportunities might take more planning and more work. These are recommendations that were fully studied by a task force, looking not just to prevent discrimination, but to study the impacts of that discrimination on things like efficiency in government operations, in the public sector workforce, and so on and so forth. So if we're not tracking right now, as we're just sweeping cuts out the door. We're pushing people out of the public sector in a massive scale right now, potentially to replace them with just consultants with none of these controls in place. And we're not tracking whether systemic discrimination is happening there. We are just deepening the waste that is happening in these ideological wars on the public sector, which again, in a lot of ways, potentially will not save money, will cost far more down the road.
All right. So as you can see, that's it. I hope you will actually leave your comments in the comment area and give us a like, follow, and subscribe. Thanks for joining us. We will be back. Have a good afternoon.